It was March 18th, 1961, and nobody at Paramount Studios could have predicted that this ordinary Thursday would witness one of the most extraordinary encounters in entertainment history. What happened when Cary Grant, Hollywood's most distinguished gentleman at 57, spoke his first words to Audrey Hepburn would leave the world's most elegant actress completely speechless. But those words weren't what anyone expected them to be. Audrey Hepburn was walking differently that spring of 1961. The triumph of Breakfast at Tiffany's still echoed through Hollywood corridors, but something had shifted in her stride. At 32, she carried herself with the poise that had made her an icon, yet those who looked closely could see something else. A restlessness, a quiet frustration that even her legendary grace couldn't entirely mask. The costume fitting for her upcoming project had run longer than expected. As Audrey emerged from stage 12, adjusting the simple black dress that would become another signature look, her mind wasn't on her career. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had with her agent the day before at the Beverly Hills Hotel. "Audrey," he had said over lunch, "the studio wants to capitalize on the Holly Golightly success. Light romantic comedies, sophisticated but not too challenging. That's your brand now." Your brand. The words had followed her home to Holmby Hills, where she'd spent the evening reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in the original Russian. A skill she'd never mentioned to anyone in Hollywood. A habit that began during the hunger winter of 1944, when books were her escape from the terror that surrounded her. But who in this town would believe that the woman they called Hollywood's princess could navigate the psychological complexities of Russian literature? Who would care that she often thought in Dutch, dreamed in French, and found solace in the philosophical depths that her elegant image seemed to contradict? That morning, Cary Grant was at Paramount for a meeting with studio executives about his next project. At 57, he remained Hollywood's definition of sophisticated charm, but he too was fighting his own battles with the industry's tendency to reduce people to their most marketable qualities. He'd spent decades perfecting the art of being Cary Grant, but sometimes he wondered if anyone remembered Archibald Leach, the boy from Bristol who'd learned to read by candlelight and never stopped being curious about the world. The pathway between Stage 12 and the executive building was unusually quiet at 11:15 in the morning. Most stars were in makeup or on set, and the lunch meetings hadn't yet begun. Audrey walked slowly, still processing her agent's words, still feeling the weight of being seen as nothing more than a beautiful face in expensive clothes. Cary Grant rounded the corner from the executive building, his mind occupied with his own thoughts about aging in Hollywood and the challenge of finding roles that respected his intelligence rather than just his charm. He was thinking about a book he'd been reading, The Brothers Karamazov, and how rarely anyone in this industry engaged with ideas that couldn't fit on a movie poster. They were 30 feet apart when their eyes met, two of the most recognizable faces in the world, finding themselves alone on a quiet studio pathway. Cary recognized her immediately, of course. Even in the simple black dress, without the elaborate styling that magazines loved, Audrey Hepburn was unmistakable. But what struck him wasn't her legendary beauty or her graceful carriage. It was something in her eyes, a depth that suggested there was far more to this woman than the industry had ever bothered to discover. Audrey saw Cary approaching and felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. Not the kind of nervousness that came from meeting a famous person, but something deeper. Here was an actor she'd admired since childhood, someone who'd managed to maintain dignity and intelligence in an industry that often rewarded neither. Someone who might actually understand the strange burden of being constantly observed but rarely truly seen. They were 20 feet apart when Cary Grant made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. Instead of the polite studio greeting or charming small talk that Hollywood expected, he looked directly into Audrey Hepburn's eyes and spoke words that cut straight through all the pretense. "I heard you've been reading Dostoevsky during the war years," Cary said, his voice carrying that distinctive mid-Atlantic accent that had become synonymous with sophistication. "Nobody in this town expects you to discuss Russian literature, do they?" Audrey stopped walking, completely stopped. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of time, she simply stared at this distinguished man who had somehow seen past everything, past the elegant image, past the princess narrative, past the carefully constructed persona that both protected and imprisoned her. He had asked the one question that no one else in Hollywood had ever thought to ask. Her famous lips, which had graced countless magazine covers and movie posters, parted slightly as if she were about to respond, but no words came. For the first time in years, Audrey Hepburn, the woman who could command attention with a single glance, found herself genuinely and completely speechless. Cary took a step closer, his expression serious and kind. "I apologize if that was too direct. It's simply that I recognize the look of someone who lives in two worlds, the one where you're expected to be charming and decorative, and the one where your mind actually lives." And then something extraordinary happened. Audrey Hepburn, who had spent years perfecting the art of being exactly what everyone expected her to be, felt something she hadn't experienced since before the war. She felt understood. "How did you—" she began, then shook her head, switching unconsciously to Dutch before catching herself. "Nobody ever asks about what I read. They assume the books in my house are just decoration." Cary nodded knowingly. "People hear my accent and assume I was born sophisticated. They don't know about the boy who read everything he could find in Bristol libraries because books were the only way to escape poverty. Just because we've learned to move gracefully through their world doesn't mean we don't think deeply about life." Audrey found herself smiling. Not the practiced smile that had launched 1,000 magazine covers, but something real and spontaneous. "During the hunger winter when we were eating tulip bulbs to survive, I would hide in our cellar with whatever books I could find. Russian novels were perfect because they were long enough to make me forget about being cold and afraid for hours." "Which was your first?" Cary asked. And Audrey could tell immediately that his interest was completely genuine, not polite conversation or an attempt to charm her. "Anna Karenina," she said, her voice growing stronger as she realized she was having the kind of conversation she'd been craving for months. "I was 16, and I understood for the first time that someone could write about the difference between who we appear to be and who we really are underneath all the expectations." She paused, struck by how perfectly that theme described both of their lives. "I suppose that's something you might understand better than most people in this industry." Cary was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering her words rather than rushing to fill the silence with empty Hollywood chatter. "More than you could possibly know," he finally said. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder if Cary Grant consumed Archibald Leach so completely that I've forgotten who I was before the cameras started rolling." They stood there in the California morning sunlight, two of the most famous and recognizable people in the entire world sharing an honest conversation that neither of them had expected to have when they woke up that morning. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the familiar sounds of a movie set in production, the shouted directions, the rolling cameras, the controlled chaos that created Hollywood magic. But in that moment, they weren't Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. They were just two people who understood what it meant to be constantly observed, but rarely truly seen. "You know what's remarkable?" Audrey said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "I came to this fitting today dreading another conversation about my image and how to position myself for roles that won't challenge audiences' expectations. But this is the first genuinely intellectual conversation I've had in this industry in longer than I can remember." Cary's expression softened, and for a moment he looked less like Hollywood royalty and more like the working-class boy from England who had somehow found himself at the center of American entertainment. "Well, I'm certainly glad my meeting ran early then. Sometimes the most meaningful encounters happen when we stop trying to be who everyone expects us to be." "Cary," Audrey said, using his name for the first time in their conversation, "can I ask you something that might sound naive?" "Of course you can. Do you ever wonder if we'll actually be able to change how people see us? I mean, truly change it, not just in carefully crafted interviews, but in the roles we're allowed to play and the conversations we're allowed to have?" Cary considered the question with the kind of seriousness that she was beginning to realize was more characteristic of him than his public image suggested. "I think about that question almost every day," he said finally. "The honest truth is, I don't know if we can change how the industry sees us. There are too many people who have too much money invested in us being exactly what they think we are. But perhaps we can find the people who are willing to see us as complete human beings instead of just marketable personalities." Audrey nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside her chest. You might be absolutely right about that. Just then, William Wyler appeared around the corner from the executive building, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to managing complex productions and temperamental artists. When he saw Audrey and Cary deep in conversation, he paused, clearly reluctant to interrupt what appeared to be a serious discussion. "I'm terribly sorry," Wyler said, approaching with obvious respect for both actors. "Audrey, the producers are ready for your input on the script revisions, and Cary, the studio heads are waiting to discuss your next project." "Of course, William," Cary said graciously, then turned back to Audrey with genuine regret in his eyes. "I've truly enjoyed this conversation. It's rare to meet someone in this business who understands the complexity of living authentically while performing professionally." "I've enjoyed it more than you could possibly know," Audrey replied, and she meant every word. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion sometime when we're not both doing meetings that will probably try to reduce us to our most superficial qualities." "I would be honored," Cary said sincerely. "And Audrey, for whatever it's worth, I think the world is fortunate to have someone who brings both intelligence and grace to an industry that rarely values either quality properly." Once again, Audrey found herself momentarily speechless. In a town where compliments were as common and meaningless as traffic jams, where everyone said exactly what they thought you wanted to hear, Cary had managed to say something that actually reached her heart. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you could possibly know." As Cary and William headed toward the executive building and Audrey continued to her own meeting, both of them carried something unexpected and precious from their brief encounter. For Cary, it was the profound realization that he wasn't alone in feeling trapped between his public image and his private intellectual life, that there was someone else in Hollywood who understood the exhausting effort required to maintain a persona that only partially reflected who you really were. For Audrey, it was the shocking and wonderful discovery that someone in this image-obsessed industry had bothered to see her as a complete human being, rather than just a collection of elegant gestures and carefully calculated charm. Someone had looked past the designer clothes and perfect posture and had seen the woman who read philosophy in multiple languages and had survived war by feeding her mind when her body was starving. That evening, as Audrey sat in her Holmby Hills living room with The Brothers Karamazov open in her lap, she found herself thinking about the brief conversation that had somehow changed everything. She had spent so many years being celebrated for her grace and beauty that she'd almost forgotten she had a mind worth celebrating too. Meanwhile, Cary Grant sat in his Beverly Hills study, holding the same book and thinking about the remarkable woman he'd encountered. He'd spent decades in Hollywood, working with the most beautiful and talented actresses of his generation, but he'd never met anyone who combined such external elegance with such internal depth. What neither of them knew was that their brief conversation had been witnessed by a script supervisor named Margaret Herrick, who happened to be walking to her car after a long night of preparation. Margaret, who had worked with countless stars over the years and had developed a professional respect for privacy, made the decision never to mention what she'd overheard to anyone in the press. But years later, she would tell close friends about the day she saw Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn having what looked like the most intellectually engaging conversation either of them had ever had on a studio lot. Neither Cary nor Audrey could have predicted that their brief encounter would influence both of their careers in ways that would become apparent only years later. Cary, encouraged by meeting someone who understood his intellectual curiosity and his frustration with being typecast as merely charming, began insisting on roles that challenged both himself and audiences' expectations of him. Audrey, meanwhile, found herself approaching her craft with a renewed sense of confidence and self-worth. The simple fact that someone had acknowledged her intelligence and her capacity for deep thought gave her the courage to be more selective about the projects she accepted, even when studios pushed for safer, more commercial choices. More importantly than any career implications, both of them carried forward the knowledge that they weren't alone in their struggles with authenticity, intellectual curiosity, and the pressure to be someone other than who they really were in an industry that often reduced complex human beings to their most marketable characteristics. The entertainment industry would continue to treat them as products to be packaged and sold to the public, but that 10-minute conversation on a quiet pathway at Paramount Studios had reminded both Cary and Audrey that underneath all the glamour and publicity and carefully orchestrated images, they were simply two people trying to hold on to their essential selves while living under the constant scrutiny of public attention. Years later, when journalists asked about her encounter with Cary Grant, Audrey would speak only to her closest friends about how meaningful their conversation had been. He didn't see Audrey Hepburn, the movie star, she would say. He saw the woman who happened to love Russian literature and had thoughts that went deeper than fashion and romance. And Cary, whenever the subject came up in interviews, would always speak with obvious respect about Audrey's intelligence and depth. People consistently underestimated her, he would say, his voice carrying a note of sadness. They saw the elegant clothes and the graceful movements and assumed that was all there was to see. But she was much more thoughtful and intellectually curious than anyone in this town ever gave her credit for. In the end, Cary Grant's first words to Audrey Hepburn didn't leave her speechless because they were romantic or flattering. They left her speechless because in a town full of people who saw only what they wanted to see, someone had finally bothered to look closely enough to see who she really was beneath all the carefully constructed elegance. Sometimes being truly seen by another human being is the most shocking and wonderful thing that can happen.